Good morning. I assume that you all are prepared for snow later today. Colton is with us this morning after his first week of classes at OSU, but will be headed back, I suspect, quickly this afternoon after worship ahead of the snow, so keep him in your prayers as he travels. We are beginning this morning in Ecclesiastes 5, verses 6 and 7. My plan was to have concluded chapter 5 last week so that we could stay on our schedule to complete Ecclesiastes this quarter. But I got bogged down in commentary and didn't make as much progress as I had hoped, and that may happen again today. One never knows. So if you would, open your Bible to Ecclesiastes, and we'll look at verses 6 and 7 of chapter 5. And just to refresh your memory, Solomon was offering instruction about worship and the making of vows. And it's in that context that we pick up our study today. And I heard that whatever it is already this morning. And we really are trying to figure out what's going on. We just aren't having a lot of success yet. I noticed that it's worse when the furnaces are running a lot and the air is drier, and I suspect it has something to do with static. But I don't know enough about these kinds of things to fill a thimble, so we may be completely off when I say that. But I digress. I guess I better move on. Let not your mouth lead you into sin. And do not say before the messenger that it was a mistake. Why should God be angry at your voice and destroy the work of your hands? For when dreams increase and words grow many, there is vanity. But God is the one you must fear. Now again, keep in mind that he's dealing with worship here in chapter 5, and one's relationship with God should not be based simply on speaking. Much words is, according to the psalmist, not an indication of righteousness, but rather the action of a fool. And it would be wise if we guarded our words, and that's in the context again here of worship. The question that I raise from those two verses is this: what warning is given in regard to the tongue? What is he actually saying? The Bible has all kinds of admonitions relative to the importance of watching our words and guarding our tongue. And I think Jesus probably in the course of his ministry gave us the definitive reason for this. The words that we speak are a true reflection of our hearts. Good words come from a good heart, and bad words are indicative of a bad heart. So what we say, others are hearing, and they're making judgments about us, and the language we use gives them the ammunition they need if they're looking for something to criticize. Unless we choose our words wisely and speak carefully with a lot of forethought. So here's what I want us to take from this. Making a vow to God is serious business. And you may say that you really don't see a lot about oaths and vows in the two verses we just read, but we're covering the 5th chapter, and that's what is being dealt with in the early verses. A vow could also be a promise. Hannah promised God a son. If she would give him a son, I will give him back to you. I have real difficulty understanding that and how hard it must have been for her. But once you make a promise like that, a vow to God, you had better honor it. So the advice here is don't open your mouth until you have carefully considered your words. What am I saying, and what does this in turn require? To follow through on your promise by simply saying, it was a mistake. Now, this is often what happens. People say things, and rather than saying it was a mistake, their defense is, well, I really didn't mean it. If you don't mean it, wouldn't it be best not to say it? And in the context of communicating with God, I think it's even more important that we mean what we say, though I'm not going to defend anyone who intentionally misrepresents something, but sometimes in the heat of battle, things come out of our mouths that would be far better left unsaid, and then we try to defend it by, well, I just didn't mean it. Why did you say it? And in the context of dealing with a promise to God, Solomon is essentially saying, don't make a promise you don't intend to do it. Big dreams and big promises, like big words, many words in other words, serve no useful purpose. It's vain to present many words, vows, and promises to God. Those who do so are in danger of incurring God's anger, but the one who fears God will not make foolish promises to him. Now, you may be thinking this is something that primarily related to the law and has little value for New Testament Christians, but I would respond that there is nothing that I can find between Matthew 1 and Revelation 22 that would indicate that it is inappropriate or sinful for Christians to essentially promise things as long as we fully intend to comply with that promise or vow. I would say to you that as a Christian, given what we know from reading the New Testament, all of our promises should always be conditioned with if God wills. And in James chapter 4, 13 through 17, James talked about that matter, and we just finished our study of the Epistle of James not that long ago. He doesn't say that it's wrong to plan. It's not wrong to even reveal your plans to others, but always plan with the understanding that God is in control, you are not. And I would suggest to you that if you're making promises to God, you should make them with that understanding as well. But every promise you make, you must be resolved to follow through with, just as Hannah did in giving her son. The text then goes on in verse 8, if you see in a province the oppression of the poor and the violation of justice and righteousness, do not be amazed at the matter, for the high official is watched by a higher, and there are yet higher ones over them. So yes, if you're paying attention, we're switching gears. We're going from a man's relationship to God and the vows he makes, and of course man here is generic. Men and women can make promises to God, and so there's a sense in which when I say man that I'm talking about mankind, and I think you understand that, but in this woke culture of ours, I'm not sure everybody does. So sometimes I just need to stop and clarify. Man, in this case, would be mankind making vows. Honor your vows. Having said that, he turns his attention now to governmental issues. And he offers some interesting comments here about officials in political positions. They're not all honest. I'm sure that's shocking to you, but there are always folks in positions of authority that misuse their authority. They have others over them, but guess what? They do the same thing, and sometimes it rises all the way to the top. And people of God need to be aware of this. So what does Solomon say regarding a government's attitude toward the poor in this text? And that's really what he's addressing. And the answer is, don't be surprised when you see government officials oppressing the poor, denying them justice, and neglecting righteousness. And you can probably think of some elected official that you are aware of who has been less than honest in his or her service as an official of the government, using their office not to represent their constituents, but to represent themselves. And again, not all politicians are like this. I think there's a belief that anybody in politics is immoral and can't be trusted and is only there for his or her personal benefit. And although I think it's obvious that that's the case in many cases, there are good people out there who just want to serve and don't see their position so much as a position of politics, but rather a position of service. But the problem is as old as civilization and government. Not everybody in positions of authority really honor that position as it should be honored. And Solomon is acknowledging that and saying to his reader, you're going to see this firsthand. You would think that there would be some consideration for the less fortunate. But the reality is that if you are in a position of wealth and influence, you're going to be treated one way. If you're poor and powerless, it's quite possible you're going to be treated another way. It's not right, but it happens. And Solomon says you're going to see this. The fact that our author goes on to say that these officials have higher officials over them has been taken to mean that government officials have a network for protecting one another, and thus the corruption is impossible to root out. Truly, there's nothing new under the sun. Now, I am taking this from a commentary series, Truth for Today, that's in our library. I've been reading the commentary on Ecclesiastes as we go through this study. And I just thought that observation is so on target for this particular text. I don't want to get political in terms of parties and all of that, but I have been, I guess, just extremely disappointed with what I've seen in our FBI and how some things have been handled, and yet no one has been held accountable. Everybody seemed to be covering everybody else so that nobody takes a fall for things that are truly indefensible. I shouldn't be surprised. Solomon says this is just the way it is. I look at things that have happened in my lifetime, and I scratch my head and wonder how people have survived the kinds of things that they've done and essentially gotten away with. And I just don't get it. But it's the way it works. It's not new. That's why I added the phrase, there's nothing new under the sun, which pervades Ecclesiastes. I look at this and I think, well, is it different today? And Solomon would say 3,000 years ago the same thing was happening. And the reason, if you want to know the reason, it's very simple. The god of this world is Satan. And sadly, the masses follow the devil, not Jesus. And so things like this shouldn't surprise us. This is the world we find ourselves in. But again, I don't want you to assume that what he says here is an indictment of everyone who holds political office, because that's just not the case. I never tell lawyer jokes because they all are detrimental to lawyers. You know, they get made fun of and ridiculed. And I know there are some bad ones out there. Avenatti comes to mind immediately. But they're not all like that. And it's just not fair to assume that that's the case. And it's almost to the point now with preachers. You talk to people out here in the world, and as somebody told me just recently, they're all just a bunch of hypocrites. And I don't deny for a moment that there aren't hypocrites out there professing to be preachers of the gospel and servants of the Most High God. But they're not all like that. And so it's probably best not to speak in broad generalities and just recognize that this is a problem that has always existed and probably always will. But don't be a part of the problem, try to be part of the solution. But this is gain for a land in every way, a king committed to cultivated fields. You think about that for a moment while I take a sip, please. It's too early for me to talk at 9 a.m. What's he mean? After addressing government corruption, verse 9 is a positive way, essentially, statement about government. What does he say in a positive way about government? He talks about a king in cultivated fields. But the context is corruption in government. So I think what he's implying is that not all officials are corrupt, as we just said in our previous comments. There are also good rulers, in this case the king, who provides for gain or advantage to the land, the governed. And cultivated fields imply that such rulers make sure that the land is productive and at least provides blessings like food for the people. The reign of such a king can be advantageous to the governed. There is such a thing as a good ruler and a bad ruler. And by the way, there are no perfect rulers. If you're looking for someone who is perfect to fill a position, you will never, ever find that person. He or she does not exist. But honest, good people, yes, you can find those. And they, when they serve properly, are a blessing to the people they serve. And so I think it was important for Solomon, who, after all, is, in my judgment, nearing the end of his reign, having experienced just about anything that a human being can experience, had almost unlimited power and riches far beyond any who had come before him. As the Queen of Sheba has said, the half hath not been told. And he's gone through life trying to experience everything to find where real meaning lies. And he's discovered that it only can be found in a proper relationship with God. He's not going to get to that conclusion till chapter 12, but that's where he's taking us. And as a ruler himself, he acknowledges there are bad ones, but there are also good ones. And when you have a good ruler, people are blessed as a result. And throughout biblical history, the world was primarily an agricultural world, was it not? You either herded or you planted. There were no factories. There were production processes, but those were generally, throughout biblical history, just individuals with special talents who utilized them. I think of pottery, for instance. A potter who was gifted with the use of his hands in molding clay would make a living that way. But generally, they didn't set up huge factories and hire hundreds of employees and mass produce things. The production line came along, did it not, with Ford? Wasn't he pretty much instrumental in the production line that speeded up the process? And that wasn't all that long ago, as you well know. So we're talking about a society where people are basically all self-employed. And the rulers can make their lives harder or easier. And Solomon is saying you're blessed when you have a king who makes it possible for you to cultivate your fields, to just go about your business. When Paul said to Christians in his epistle to Timothy that we're to pray for kings and magistrates and all that are in authority, that we might lead, he said, a quiet and peaceful life in all godliness and honesty. The average Christian needs to understand that serving God just means living your life every day in a way that radiates Jesus to the people around you. Doesn't require spectacular things. It doesn't require you to accumulate vast resources. In fact, as Christians, we pray for our government so that we can just live our lives as God wants us to live them. And we're to pray for those in authority without regard to what their political views may be. We may not share those views, but we can certainly pray that they will rule in such a way that we can cultivate our fields, that we can live a quiet and peaceful life in godliness and honesty. And that's what Paul wrote to Timothy. At the time he wrote that, Nero was the emperor of Rome. He was the king, in fact, in the broad sense, as Caesar, who governed even Palestine, which was Roman territory at this time. And he was saying, and though it doesn't say specifically Nero, when he says pray for kings and magistrates and all that are in authority, it's all government officials, even to the emperor. And this emperor is clearly a corrupt, immoral, I wouldn't say godless man, because he is an idolater, but he's clearly not a God-fearing man. But pray for him. But pray that you can lead a quiet and peaceful life. What more do we really need? If government essentially just would get out of our way and let us lead our lives as God tells us to lead them, that's our goal. And sometimes I think that goal gets lost. I'm just telling you what the Scriptures say, by the way. Verse 10, he who loves money will not be satisfied with money, nor he who loves wealth with his income. This also is vanity. Now, you may say, is he switching gears again? I don't think so. Because government and money go hand in hand. And the motivation for many corrupt officials is the acquisition of more and more money. There's a movement afoot right now that I doubt gets anywhere that wants to pass legislation that says elected officials in the House and Senate cannot profit through the stock market. They cannot buy and sell because they are privy to information that can help them make boatloads of money. And it's not right. But what happens is that our Congress and Senate often pass laws which they exempt themselves from observing, and that's not right either. I think if I were in office, I could clear this all up in probably 20 minutes. Just tell them anything you pass, you have to abide by yourself. They'll pass a lot less legislation. And the less legislation, the less government, the better off we all are. But I have no desire to be in office. I couldn't get elected if I wanted to, because people would ask me questions and I would answer them, and that would be offensive because they wouldn't like my answers. But Solomon is saying this problem with money is very real and it impacts politics. So what is said about one who loves money here? And remember, the context is civil government and how corrupt officials can be. Not always are, but can be. Money never brings satisfaction. Solomon acknowledges that, and of course you find that elsewhere in Scripture. And it doesn't matter how much you have, you always want just a little bit more. You never have enough. And the Bible's just replete with this warning. Again, it's in the context of the king who provides an environment where the fields can be cultivated. But the idea is, very simply, that people are motivated by money, and money never satisfies us. Because no matter how much we have, we always want just a little bit more. But it is not inherently evil. And you can be very financially successful and very faithful to God. I think Abraham was a tremendously successful man in terms of how the world measures success. He had vast resources. He was very wealthy. But what really makes Abraham stand out is his faith. And Isaac and Jacob, the same could be said of them. They were not poor. Job, who is described as a man who is upright and feared God and eschewed evil, perfect and just, and probably a contemporary of Abraham, was tremendously wealthy. Seemed to have it all until it was taken from him. The only thing he didn't lose was his faith, but that's the only thing that really mattered. But even with his vast wealth, he was faithful to God. In the New Testament, you meet people who are quite successful, but understand the importance of putting spiritual things first. I think of Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus come to mind immediately. And what Timothy, 1 Timothy 6:10 warns against is not money, as you well know, but the love of money. The desire for more and more and more. And it motivates, sadly, much of the world, and certainly, in context, those in positions of authority. When goods increase, they increase who eat them. And what advantage has their owner but to see them with his eyes? What is the purpose or advantage of being productive and having a great deal? And what happens to those goods when you prosper? Here's what we need to know. When someone sees his wealth, goods increase. That is, God blesses them. He will see an increase in those who want to share in his wealth, family, friends. Others will be asking for gifts or donations. That's those who consume them. And the prosperous man does little more than observe, see with his own eyes, the spectacle. The point that he's making is that with greater wealth comes greater responsibility and greater demands, and what you think is promised is not actually what you're going to receive. I look at what's occurred since our society decided that gambling is no longer sinful. And that's been within my lifetime. When I was born into this world, it was generally acknowledged that gambling was a sin. But churches and governments both discovered they could raise lots and lots and lots of money through gambling. And so it stopped being sin and became a revenue enhancer. And so lotteries, among other things, became very popular. And people would win vast sums. But by and large, from what I've been able to read, they had no clue how to use it and generally ended up losing it. And just hounded by everybody, not just friends and relatives, but everybody who knew that they had struck it rich or suddenly at their door knocking and needing help. That's not how I want to live my life. Is that the way you want to live yours? In essence, that's what Solomon is saying here is going to happen. It's not everything it's cracked up to be. And somebody will always say in return or response, well, I'd like to have more to find out if you're really right or not. And I understand where you're coming from, but I will tell you, as I've told you numerous times, if you aren't happy with what you have now, you're not going to be happy if you have more of it. Money is not the key to happiness, to fulfillment, to meaning in life. Sweet is the sleep of a laborer who eats little or much, but the full stomach of the rich will not let him sleep. Now you think about that for a moment. Have you tossed and turned half the night or longer because you had a big meal and a rich dessert and ate more than you should have and then went to bed and wonder, why can't I sleep? It would be better to feast on far less after working a long, hard day and go to bed, because you're going to sleep whether your belly's completely full or not, because that's what labor, generally work, will bring about. And he says it's better to work hard all day even though you don't fill your belly completely at evening, which is when they would eat their meal, and get a good night's rest, than to fill your belly with all these delicacies and overeat and then not be able to sleep. So what's said regarding the sleep of the laboring man in comparison to the rich? Well, the laboring man will sleep, and the rich often doesn't, not just because his belly is too full, but because he's weighed down by all these thoughts about how do I keep what I have? And what have we learned already about this? Solomon has already told us that this is what he's observed. A man who works night and day and is very productive and brings it all in, and then he dies, and it's left to others, and he doesn't have a clue what they'll do with what he has worked so hard for. Does this make sense? Is it not foolishness? And his response is, it is. Why do we conduct ourselves that way? Jesus was addressing this in Luke 12:15 when he said, a man's life does not consist in the abundance of the things which he possesses. The working man sleeps soundly. His sleep is pleasant. After a day of hard work, even his hunger, not satisfied sufficiently, doesn't keep him from a good night's rest. The rich man, on the other hand, has a full stomach, but just can't sleep. And so being wealthy in the sense in which Solomon is considering it here isn't necessarily the blessing that people think it is. And at some point in life, I think we all look back and we get sentimental and we reflect on the memories we hold most precious. And when we do that, they almost never revolve around things. They revolve around people. And in particular, family. And you can have all kinds of money, but if your home life is in turmoil, I wouldn't call you rich. You can have very little in this world, but if you've got a loving home, you're wealthy. And I know the world doesn't understand it, but it doesn't make it any less true. I was thinking just about this recently. The first home I remember as a youngster, it had a bedroom, a closet, a bedroom, and a kitchen. That was it. And 5 of us lived in it. We eventually got a living room, another room, and then a bathroom. We thought, boy, this is wonderful. I especially, because I had a job prior to the bathroom that I just attested. Started when I was 6 and didn't end until I got a bathroom. We didn't realize how poor we were because we were just as happy as we could be and never went hungry and always had clothes to wear. They weren't expensive clothes. Kept us warm and covered. And I look back, and there's not a thing that I can focus on that I can honestly say makes me happy, makes me smile. But the people and the time together and what we did, that's a different story. And I'm just speaking here off the cuff. I think a lot of families today have lost sight of that. A lot of parents think they need to give their kids everything out there, and in the process of doing that, fail to give them the one thing they need: your time and attention. Don't make that mistake. I realize I'm pretty much preaching to the choir now because most of our kids in here are raised and on their own, but those are the things that we will remember, not the material things. There's a grievous evil that I have seen under the sun. Riches were kept by their owner to his hurt, and those riches were lost in a bad venture. And he is father of a son, but he has nothing in his hand. So, as you look at that, he's describing a situation where a man has had tremendous material success, then made a bad investment, lost it all. He has a son, and now he has nothing by which he can support his son. And after all, isn't that what labor is all about? Earning a wage so that we can meet the needs of the people we care about. It is not our responsibility to satisfy every want or desire of our offspring. God doesn't do that for us, does he? Doesn't he give us in promise all that we need, but he never hints at giving us everything we want. And what is true of our relationship with our Heavenly Father should be true in terms of our physical families as well. What's called a grievous or sore evil by Solomon in this text? Well, it's a grievous evil when riches are hoarded or kept to the owner's hurt, and then through bad investments, ventures lost, preventing a father from leaving an inheritance for his own son. And that's what Solomon is talking about, and what generally is at the core of bad investments that end up losing the investor everything. Greed, thank you, my dear. Greed. Folks, if it seems too good to be true, you know what? It ain't true. If somebody tells you they can double your money in 6 months or a year, run. Run. Interest rates right now are extremely low. If you find somebody offering you 10, 12, 15%, go the other direction as quickly as you can. Now, that's not always been the case. I was reading a bulletin from early in 1985. A congregation here in the valley was getting ready for a building project. They were going to sell $450,000 in bonds. And I continued to read, caught my interest. I knew the congregation, and what caught my attention, they were selling bonds in increments of $250 for anywhere from 3 months to 12 years. Here is the kicker. The interest rates were anywhere from 10 to 14%. 1985. 10 to 14%. And I think I have a little savings account at Chase, and it's paying 0.02, pardon me. 0.02. That's not much. I'd like to be getting 10 to 12 or 14%, wouldn't you? But that would mean that inflation was through the roof, and it almost is already, and everything would be skyrocketing. So don't be surprised if you see interest rates start to increase. Let's hope they don't get where they were then. But I just found that really fascinating. Generally, if you hear about somebody offering those kinds of rates today, it's time to run. Or you'll end up like this man. You'll lose everything and not have anything to leave the people that matter most to you. As it came from his mother's womb, or as he came from his mother's womb, he shall go again. Naked as he came, and shall take nothing for his toil that he may carry away in his hand. This also is a grievous evil. Just as he came, so shall he go. And what gain is there to him who toils for the wind? Moreover, all his days he eats in darkness, in much vexation and sickness and anger. Well, Solomon, what in the world are you talking about now? This is true of man's birth and death. In what sense? We come into this world with nothing. And guess what? We leave the same way. All his days he eats in darkness cheerlessly. He doesn't learn to enjoy life, to appreciate what he has. He eats in darkness without real cheer or joy, and much sorrow, sickness, and wrath come his way. and he dies. And in death, he takes everything he brought with him at birth into death. Absolutely nothing. There again, why? Why do we work so hard to accumulate things that we cannot possibly hold to? Behold, what I have seen to be good and fitting is to eat and drink and find enjoyment in all the toil with which one toils under the sun, the few days of his life that God has given him, for this is his lot. So what is good? Well, Solomon says it's good, enjoyable, and worthwhile to eat and drink and find satisfaction in one's labors, one's lot in life. God intended men to work and find satisfaction in their labor. And you can look at Genesis 2:15, even in the garden, they toiled 3:17-19 through sin. That toil became much more laborious, but nonetheless, work has always been a part of the creation. 1 Thessalonians 4 and 2 Thessalonians 3 underscore the importance of our working with our hands to meet our needs and to assist others in need, and says if a man won't work, not if a man can't, but if he won't work, he shouldn't eat. So there you have it. Everyone also to whom God has given wealth and possessions and power to enjoy them and to accept his lot and rejoice in his toil, this is the gift of God. For he will not much remember the days of his life, because God keeps him occupied with joy in his heart. Okay, Solomon, what do you mean here? This is how the rich should view their riches. They should see them as gifts from God to be joyously received and used. Furthermore, the wealthy man blessed by God is thankful to God that he has a job and is physically able to do the work. He experiences gladness in his heart because he has viewed life from a proper perspective. And that's how the text closes. John, was that the first bell? We got how many more minutes? 3 more minutes. Okay, here's the quick summary through chapter 5 right now, as Solomon really deals with the limits of wealth, and this will conclude our study. First, it cannot bring satisfaction. You see that in verse 10. Additionally, it attracts a crowd of dependents, people constantly, friends, family, and even folks who don't know you but hear about you are constantly making demands. It's exhausting. Third, it disturbs one's peace of mind, prevents you from really resting and sleeping. Fourth, it can be easily misused. Wealth is a good thing, properly used, is extremely harmful when misused. Fifth, it is easily lost, verse 14. Sixth, it cannot be taken beyond the grave. You leave everything behind, even the gold fillings in your teeth. If you've got gold, it stays here. You cannot take it with you. Seventh, its loss brings great suffering. And then we will conclude, only a life with God brings man meaning and enjoyment, verses 18 through 20. And God willing, next week we can start chapter 6. I know that chapter 5 deals with at least 3 different things, but when you think about them in context, they really do fit together. You start out with worship and end up with how do you use what you have as God would have it to be used. And it's filled with warnings for those who fail to count their blessings and put them to good use. So that's our study today, and we're actually finishing with a minute to spare. God willing, next Sunday morning we'll start chapter 6, verses 1 and 2. You can visit for a little bit if you'd like now.